Hello. Oh, you can hear me. Are we on, Joe? Amazing. We're live. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this National Science Week for another Experimental Science 2023. This is the fourth iteration, which is pretty exciting. This is a science sipping, beer tasting panel event where we explore the incredible science behind everyone's favourite drink, beer. Hey! But before we begin, and after that feedback, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon the land on which we are holding this event, the Moanina people of Nipaluna. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of those joining us online via the live stream across Australia. So our name's Matt and Kelsey. We're the co-founders of Science Made Beerable, a not-for-profit that aims to break down the exciting and often complex science of beer. And we're thrilled this year, after she couldn't join us live on stage 2 years ago, to have certified Cicerone and Science Made Beerable committee member Lindsay Grieg.
Thank you. Hi.
So Lindsay will also be taking the reins as an MC, but will be our sensory and snack pairing expert.
Which is such a good expert to be. It is probably the best one. Snacks.
But we'll touch on that shortly. Yeah, get ready for that. We're excited to have it at the live event as well. This year we switched things up a little bit compared to previous years. So this year we asked Range Brewing, Molly Rose and Shambles to step into the lab and brew not just one beer, but two. You may be asking why two beers? Well, each brewery has brewed a set of beers that essentially have the same ingredients, basically experience the same conditions, except for one key experimental difference. And the aim of these paired beers is to answer these delicious scientific questions that these brewers have set themselves. And we're hoping that we can answer those questions tonight as we taste the beers and talk about the science behind them. So without further ado, let's introduce the panel for tonight. We have Ali Thompson from Brisbane-based hop heavyweight Range Brewing.
Hi.
We have Nick Sandery, founder and brewer of the innovative Molly Rose Brewing from Collingwood. And from this very building, via some of the biggest breweries in the Southern Hemisphere, we have Henry Tanner, the lead brewer at Hobart's Shambles Brewery.
So before we get started, just got some thank yous and housekeeping. So firstly, want to thank our sponsors, National Science Week, Inspiring Tasmania, thanks to Hop Products Australia, Voyager Craft Malt and Bluestone Yeast that contributed ingredients that went into the beers we're going to taste tonight. Also thanks to Convoy Kegs for the tapped beer that we've got here and at the watch parties tonight. A huge thank you to Shambles for hosting us yet again. Huge supporters of beer and science. We love you guys. Thanks to Flair Productions for the videography tonight. And thanks to Brendan Veronese Audiovisual for the sound and lighting. Rosie Honan did our beautiful artwork and design this year. And thanks to Black Hearts and Sparrows for doing all the distribution of our beer for everyone watching at home tonight. We've got some wonderful volunteers on the floor tonight helping out. So we've got Ollie, Reed, Karcher and Zane, and you'll get to know these people very well and they'll be your best friends bringing the beers out. Also, if you don't have a snack plate in front of you or if you realise you're missing a beer or something, pop your hand up and one of them will come and help you. Welcome to all of our at-home viewers. Thanks for joining anywhere from across Australia. We love that this event isn't just for Hobart, that we can have people all across Australia joining. We've also got two awesome watch parties happening in the north of the state in Launceston and Devonport at St John and Empress. So, hello. We hope you've all got your snacks ready that Lindsay's expertly paired. Each snack has been designed to be tasted with a specific beer pair tonight. So make sure you don't hoe into them straight away. Try and refrain, and Lindsay will talk through what ones are being paired with which beers later.
Please resist. Resist. The test of self-will.
Those caramel crowns look pretty good. to
Kind
me.
of
Starting to
melting.
melt up
And
here, though.
it is the last one, so you're going to have to wait all night before you can eat that caramel crown.
Some housekeeping for those here in Shambles. The toilets are back through the door you came through. The fire exits are also back through the door you came through, and also another one out the back through the large doors. We'll have a short intermission for everyone at around 8:10, so you can go and do what you need to do, and then come back and we'll get things back on track. Also, the event will be recorded and will be straight up on our Facebook page to watch back later at any time. Oh, and please remember to take photos wherever you are, here in the live event, at the watch parties, at home. Tag us in your socials. We'd love to see how you're joining in.
And ask questions.
Yeah, and so also we would love anyone online at the watch parties and also in the audience to feel free to ask questions to our brewers all through the night. The online questions will be monitored as we go, and we will ask them to the brewers as we go, and we'll do a big Q&A part at the end of the event. Cool. So without further ado, we'll get into the first beer. That we're still getting them handed out, but they should be all around shortly. So first we have Thompson from Range Brewing, and Range have brewed 2 beers, 2 pale ales, in with the old and out with the new. So Ali, if you could start by introducing yourself, Range Brewery, and tell us about your experiment.
Hey guys, I'm Ali. I'm the lead brewer at Range Brewing in Brisbane. We are a small batch craft brewery, and our actual motto since inception is forever evolving, forever exploring. So this is a really cool thing to be a part of. We kind of treat brewing as it very much is, a giant big experiment. So being, what was it, hop heavyweights, you called us? Yeah, we're quite well known for loving our hops at Range Brewing. You will often see the really hop-focused styles if you walk into our tap room. So your IPAs, your double IPAs, your double dry hopped IPAs, your triple dry hopped IPAs. So hops is a big passion of ours, but also a huge expense for ours. It's one of the most expensive ingredients in brewing. And it is often that in the dry hopping process, so just a really short bit on dry hopping, basically that is the process of adding hops either during fermentation or right at the end in the conditioning period, and we like to use a lot of them. So being small scale, that's quite expensive, and seeing them go down the drain or into our sort of solid buckets is pretty sad, especially when they still smell so incredible going down the drain. And it's for good reason. A lot of the research out there sees that maybe only 50% of the biomass of hops is utilized in dry hopping, and that's what's giving you those beautiful fruity, resinous, piney flavors and aroma in those hop-focused beers. So we have wanted to look at something like this for a long time, of being able to capture that second use and some of those oils, alpha acids that might still be sitting in those spent hops. So we brewed 2 pale ales, identical in ingredients, identical in yeast, identical tanks sitting next to each other. And the only thing difference is we dry hopped the first with Citra and Vic Secret hops, and then used those exact same hops in the second one.
As in, you literally took those hops from the first beer and put them into the second beer.
Yes, except the other way around. So we transferred, once we had dry hopped the beer, it then sat on hops for 48 hours with a light CO2 rouse to kind of mix them all up in there and get the best contact time. We have a centrifuge, so that's a sort of fining or polishing piece of kit that we use. So we then centrifuged that tank of beer. So I believe, are we trying out with the new first here?
Yes.
Yes,
Yep.
So that's this one here. So that has the fresh pellets of Citra and Vic Citra in it. We then transferred that into a conditioning bright tank, and with what was left at the bottom all those lovely used hops, we then transferred in with the old into it. So straight through that used hop material.
Amazing. How exciting. We're going to get into the tastings. We'll hand over to Lindsay to talk through what snacks we're tasting our beer with.
Yeah, so with this one, real quick, just a little tasting 101. People always ask whether or not they should do the snack then the beer then the snack. I recommend you get to know each beer on its own independently, then try the snack independently, and then try them together and see how it kind of changes your perception. For each set of beers, there's one snack that goes with one of the beers. What's fun about this is going to be a taste experiment in multiple ways. We're going to see what I intended the snack to go with, and then the other beer doesn't quite work as well, or didn't when I initially paired them. So you should be able to taste the difference between what makes a good pairing and what makes a bad pairing, or just not as good, hopefully, if everything works out the way I wanted it to. So for this set of pairings, I actually paired the chicken Smith's chicken flavored. They're the little crinkly ones. And it's going with the old.
Which I think this one is, actually.
Huh?
Yeah.
Wait, this is
I've
in with old?
just got authority that this is out with the old.
Out with
in
the
with
old.
the old.
In with the old. Out with the new.
Tongue twisters.
So
Yeah, sorry.
the idea behind this pairing was just that initially when I tried these beers a few weeks ago, there was still some like grassy character coming through. For some reason, the chicken flavoring on these little chips wipe that grassiness away and allows the very bright pineapple lolly characteristics of the hop to kind of shine through. So, cheers. But try it with both.
Cool. So traditionally in science, when we perform an experiment, we come up with we form a hypothesis before we do the experiment, which is basically a best guess of what we think might happen. And then we seek to test that hypothesis. So what was your hypothesis in this experiment? What did you expect to happen?
Pretty simple, and it might not sound very exciting in hypothesis form, but if I dry hop an identical pale ale with spent, recycled, whatever you want to call it, hops, it will be similar, but less aroma, less flavour, less haze, less mouthfeel. And obviously we were hoping to be surprised, maybe.
Yeah, so I when you first told us this experiment idea, I had the picture of reusing tea bags in my mind. Who else's dad reuses tea bags?
Yep.
Yeah. What's with dads and reusing tea bags? But you know, like the first time you brew a tea with a tea bag, it's got beautiful malt flavors and it's sweet, but it also has the nice bitterness from the tannins. And then successively, as you use a tea bag, it gets pretty awful. Like, you know, you don't have the beautiful sweetness anymore. It's just the bitterness, and it's not as a darker color. And so
Pretty sad.
Pretty sad tea. What's the point? Anyway, but obviously this isn't happening in these beers. The second beer, the one that has the used hops or spent hops, however we want to call them, still has a lot of those flavours. It's still beautifully flavoured pale ale, though it is different.
Yes, absolutely. So we were really pleasantly surprised, and both beers have actually taken on quite an interesting life since we first brewed them. As many people may know, drinking hops fade fast, and a beer can age and really take on new flavours if you use a heavy dry hop in them. I mean, this isn't very heavy, it's just a pale ale, so we're on the lighter end of the hoppy scale. But what we found is that with the new, so that was the fresh T90 pallets, initially we got really punchy Vic Secret characteristics coming through, that sort of woody, piney, herbal notes on the nose. And then while we still got Vic Secret characteristics coming through in with the old, it was more of those tropical, sweet citrus, and they have sort of all developed as we've gone on.
All right, just go find my next question.
No, it's all right. I can keep rambling if you want.
I was just gonna say they have intensified, like that lolly character has intensified so much as the beer ages, which is not what you expect at all. Like we think like hazy IPAs, hazy pale ales, you should drink them fresh, drink them right away.
Absolutely.
But the recycled hops have somehow gotten better
Yeah.
as
yeah.
it ages.
And I don't know if it's because, they never had those sort of more volatile compounds in the first place that we've lost with that first use. And so what we sort of got is what we're going to have for a longer period of time with the second pale. But although the aroma and the sort of mouthfeel and the haze is that little bit less, it makes it a little bit more delicate and refined.
So what hop varieties did you choose for this beer, and do you think some varieties are more suited to this kind of method than others?
It's a very good question, and one I probably can't answer until I do some more experiments. But in this particular case, we used Citra and Vic's Secret. We chose this combo because, A, it's a great combo. Citra, citrus, beautiful, and then melding with the kind of piney tropical notes of Vic's Secret. We also know both those hops very well at Range Brewing, so doing an experiment with them, we sort of knew what to expect, and we would be surprised or not surprised with the outcome because we are more familiar with them. I would be really interested to use some of those maybe more woody, herbaceous sort of styles of hops to see what some of those underlying characters might be brought forward in a spent dry hop technique. But yeah, definitely something I look into trying out more and more with a variety of different styles.
So we had a question come through from the audience in the lead up to the event, and we've actually had it from more than one brewer. They're interested in what the contact time was for both of these beers, but could you also explain what contact time is for those of us who aren't brewers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I assume they're talking about the contact time of the dry hop itself. So that was another thing that we wanted to keep exactly the same across these two beers to make it a controlled experiment. So once we'd actually finished ferment for both these beers, and once they passed the necessary tests, we then crash chill them to 14 degrees. We pull the yeast cells out so that there's no potential for something called hop creep when we add the hops, which we may touch on later. And then they are dry hopped, and they spend 48 hours on hops with 3 rousers across those 2 days. So that's just a 1 minute burst of CO2 into the tank under pressure so that it gets some nice mixing of the hops and a better contact time with those hops. And then we pretty much did the exact same thing with those spent hops with that sort of added rouse that second beer gets to go through the spent hops in its second transfer.
And so to get these beautiful fruity aromas and flavours in beer, the hops are added in this dry hopping stage, as you mentioned earlier. But you need to add a hell of a lot of hops, right?
Correct.
And that's an expensive step, as you said.
Correct.
So why is this reuse of hops in this stage not more common practice?
Very good question. I personally would put it a lot down to timing. So, I mean, in our brewery, we're not big. We have 16 tanks that might have 8 different styles. So they're not all going to be hoppy. They're not all going to have a similar timeline. When a beer is ready for the next step or ready to be dry hopped, there might not be hops from another beer ready. So it would be a whole other part of your scheduling to try and work it. I mean, this was a perfect experiment for us. We had them side by side. They were both ready to go at the same time. So that would be a huge aspect of trying to align your beers in a way while you're also trying to align things like release schedules and yeast propagation. So that would be a big guess. 2, it hasn't really been done or published a lot of, especially in hop-focused beers. So it's the fear of the unknown, I guess. And it's also an extra double handling step. So there's risk of contamination, there's risk of aging and stuff like that. So I think there's just a lot unknown, and especially in this country, until it's maybe more common practice with a little bit more conversation about it. Us brewers are a pretty chatty bunch. I think it could spread and it could become very popular.
We need to somehow patent this.
You'd also have to come up with another acronym.
Yes. Yeah. There's not many nice words to use with recycled or spent or
Regurgitated?
pre-loved.
And so you also mentioned that people are wary of a thing called hop creep. Can you explain what hop creep is and whether you saw any of this in the beer?
Yeah, absolutely. So hop creep is a phenomena that basically when you add hops to a beer, they have an enzyme potential to break down some of your longer chain or larger sugars that were previously not able to be fermented in the first fermentation process. So the yeast just didn't even target it. And then if they're sitting in the wort and the enzymes break them down and you still have yeast in solution, you can create a secondary fermentation. So there's pros and cons to this, but mainly cons, because if you've designed a perfect recipe and you want to hit a specific ABV or you have a certain taste profile and then it's attenuating further, that could lead to more perceived dryness. You can also, if it's happening and you don't know it's happening, then you can get re-ferment in can, higher levels of carbonation, all sorts of problems like that. And then if there isn't healthy yeast, but there's, a small amount of yeast left and it doesn't properly ferment in that secondary fermentation, you get risks of things in beer like diacetyl, if anyone's heard of that, which is a really bad fault in beer if the yeast isn't able to break down those sugars in a healthy way. So because of that, which is why we did this experiment post-ferment, and we spent 5 days conditioning these beers to get that yeast cell count below 2 million cells per milliliter, because we thought that was a sort of healthy place that there wasn't enough yeast to create hop creep.
And another way, I was just thinking, is there another way to reuse hops or to make this whole process more sustainable? If you were to use hops that had previously been used in a dry hopping stage in like an earlier boil hop stage where the hops are more traditionally added for a bittering flavour?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a very broad stroke, basically the earlier you add hops in the brewing process, the more they are to do with the bitterness. The later, the more sort of fruity aromas, flavours. So, yes, in short, and that is what, when I was doing a lot of research about this, the majority of the literature and the majority of breweries around the world who do actually do that, and they use those spent hops in the bittering side. However, for us and our size, we, like I said, are a hop-focused brewery, and we're only a 12 hectolitre brew house. So on a given brew, we may only use 400 grams of bittering hops, whereas the same dry hop for that beer may be in the ballpark of 50 to 100 times that. So for us, it's not that it couldn't work. It just wasn't, the most viable way of looking at it. Whereas if we could do it on a larger scale for the dry hop, that would be huge. So yes, it does happen. It is being used, but I couldn't find much literature on something like this.
Just to jump in, does everyone here have both beers? Raise your hand if not. Oh, he's being cheeky, I think. He's being cheeky.
Great. So, luckily now we've all got to both beers in front of us. But so both these beers are beautiful fruity pales, but as you said, they are quite different. You know, we've got the In With the Old is more clear. It has less of a head, or I don't know what you'd call that. Less
Less of a haze to it, for
less
sure.
of a haze. But they're still very fruity, and like you say, there are flavours in with the old that you're not picking up out with the new. And so do you think those flavours are actually both in both beers, but it's the fact that the fresher, first time used hops have other or more aromatics that are disguising those flavours that are actually in there? And then you're removing that in the first use of the hops, and then so in the second use of them, you're actually you're unmasking flavours that are there that you haven't noticed before.
100% that could be what's going on. I mean, I sort of touched a little bit on, there's so much going on in hop oils, and there's all these different components, and some that are released to differing amounts, and there's all these studies going on about how to release them and what hops have more of what thiols and oxygenated compounds and linalool and you can go deep diving into this. And some of those more volatile compounds that give you those sort of more woody, spicy notes, I personally get a lot more in with the new, out with the new. See, I even get stumbled on it. And for sure, it is that little bit more punchy on the nose and a little bit more of a bigger mouthfeel. And then perhaps that is masking some of those more delicate, fruity flavours that are giving it a little bit more of a bigger body complex in the first one. Or maybe it took that second use to get those really delicate, fruity pineapple flavours out of it. Something to look into.
More experiments needed.
Absolutely.
Did you take a pH of these two beers?
Yes.
Is there a difference?
Post dry hop, I would have to look, but I think it was very minimal. Yeah. If anything, marginally higher on the fresher dry hop. Yeah.
What was your thinking behind that question?
To me, it tastes like the old dry hops is a little bit higher pH.
Yep. Yeah.
And when you dry hop, the pH goes up in a beer. So I was wondering if all of that pH changing power of the hops has actually been spent on the first one, or maybe it's come out a bit more on the second one, because the first one tastes a little bit more acidic and the second one tastes a bit more broad,
Okay.
which to me, when acid is used in beer, it always changes the palate weight and it changes the flavour profile dramatically.
For
so
sure.
I was wondering if that was playing a part. So we could measure that.
I would definitely have to look back and double check, but it wasn't something that stood out in the experiment.
I mean, that just goes to show how, one of these small changes in beer can make so many differences because of science, which is so cool. So you're obviously really happy with this result. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And
pleasantly surprised.
so will Range be using spent hops in the future? Are you hoping to continue with this kind of method?
100%. I think it was Matt, one of our co-founders, who came down. He can't help himself, if a new beer's being packaged or something's going through the centrifuge, there's always a few people who want to come try it fresh off. And I think his first words were, "Great, we use spent hops now." So that was a big tick of approval. And we actually had a sort of team-wide tasting a week before I came down just to see how these pales had aged and how the hop character had changed over time. And it was a resounding group. We all favoured the In With the Old. So I think that says a lot. And we would also, as it usually does, one experiment leads into probably 4 other questions that we then want to ask. So there's a number of things we want to try for the next round, and things like, rather than just going from pale to pale, maybe going from some of those heavier styles like a double IPA or an IPA into a pale to try and get some of that more haze, more body, more character through.
Is there certain styles that you wouldn't, like variations that you wouldn't go, like say for example a pale to an IPA or?
Yeah, I think that might be a bit too far on the lackluster scale. I mean, you can, when you see them side by side here in the light, you definitely see that difference in haze. And for, you know, a brewery who likes to produce some hazy IPAs, I think if we started negating on that, it would be a bit of a disaster. So
I was just wondering, why do you think the haze is so different between the two?
I mean, considering we did everything else identically
Yeah,
the
it's pretty
same.
fascinating, to be honest.
I mean, one big thing is just the matter alone. So even though, you know, we're using the same amount, you know, probably
right.
50% of that biomatter has already been taken
gone.
out
Yep.
and roused into this beer. So while we're centrifuging, we're doing it at a pretty fast speed to try and keep a lot of that haze and body and flavour in there. So that's why I would really like to try going from some of those bigger styles into a smaller, so like a double IPA into a pale, just so there is that amount of matter there to try and replicate what a fresh dry hop would be.
Yeah, interesting.
Just for some audience questions, well, not even. I just want to know who likes the first one better, the one that used the old hops. Okay. Who likes the one that used the fresh hops better? So the second glass you got. Fascinating.
So I would say
Love
there's
it.
more people preferred the
reused
in
hops?
with the reused beer.
Yeah.
Definitely a right side of the room swing.
We'd be interested to know what you're thinking at home too. So write in the comments what you're thinking.
Yeah, because this is what's so great about this one compared to previous years is now we can ask side by side, like, what do you prefer? And have some data around it. So, yeah.
So we have a little bit of time to look for some questions in the audience. Oh, there's a few already. So we'll just get a microphone coming round. We need to make sure the people watching the live stream can hear you.
Hey, I think you've already touched on it a bit, but do you think that this kind of brewing with spent hops might allow smaller brew houses that maybe do less hoppy beers to get into that, dare I say, hop heavyweight kind of area? If they're not doing it already, they might be able to buy more hops and do a really hop heavy and then do like their normal pale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and like I said, the more people who try it and start writing about it and talking about it and trying it, the more people might be game to do it as well. If they've got that time schedule where they can do it. I know that's what we want to do now. We want to start scheduling so that we can have one going into the other. And we've been wanting to do this for maybe 4 years, but I dare say we haven't wanted to take the risk because then you might be left with a whole tank of a dud. So I think if more people do it and more people enjoy it, then yeah, absolutely. I think it opens a whole network for people to try it themselves.
Really cool. Thanks for taking the first step.
Do you think there's legal, like, do you think you have to put on the can, you know, how you put your different hop varieties? Do you think people should say whether it is reused hops?
I think so from a sustainability point more than anything, because I think it's a big tick in that column. I mean, you know, any way that we can sort of reduce our imprint in the brewing world is brilliant. So I don't know why you wouldn't want to put it on the can. But as long as you're doing everything in the same sort of sanitary way that you do with all other brewing aspects, I don't think there's any risk to it. Your hop supplier might get a little bit grumpy at you, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, a lot of breweries already reuse yeast up to X amount of gens. So, yeah, why not try it with hops?
Absolutely.
Malt's next.
Ooh.
G'day. Just out of curiosity, because I've never heard of breweries recycling hops previously, and you said that you found some for bittering. Do you mind if I ask which breweries you found?
Great question. I would have to look at my list on my phone so that I don't get it wrong. But there's a lot of American breweries, if you look it up, like the bigger ones, who definitely use it in the bittering side. And then there was a lot of breweries that I'd never heard of, but who do some of your more like interesting Belgian styles and stuff like that might be not so hop forward. And they would go from something like an IPA into maybe a wild ale even, so that even if there was that secondary fermentation, that's also not an issue. So yeah, I can definitely show you a list. I don't want to name drop in case I get this wrong, but there is an Australian brewery, I'm pretty sure, who reuses from like a dipper to a pale ale. And that, I think it's Deeds who do that. And one of their core pales was doing that for a long time, which is awesome.
So I've got another audience question.
Make sure you send them in online too. I don't have any coming through yet, but keep an eye out.
Breweries are doing it pretty tough at the moment with the cost of living pressure and all that sort of thing. Could you see this as being a way forward for the smaller craft breweries who have to save some money that they can make, as you said, the dipper become a pale ale? Are the cost savings that significant that it could actually help them out in the long run?
I think depending on your size and, you know, all breweries are different with their hop contracts and stuff like that, and the styles of beers that they're producing. But I do think anyways you can save money, especially if it's going into a core product. That would be such a fantastic thing if you could produce a core pale ale all with recycled hops. I think in the long term you'd see a huge financial gain, yeah.
Any other questions out there? No? One from Lindsay.
Oh, I did just want to clear up on the snack pairings just because I forgot. The regular chips, these are your wild card, so make sure you're trying like one chip with every beer as well. They're just plain kettle chips, but some people think they go with everything, and I'm here to prove that thought wrong. That's all.
Why do people think they go with everything?
Well, because it's just like, oh, like fries go with everything, chips go with everything, peanuts go with everything. They don't actually. Like, I had a kettle chip with this, and it isn't great. This just turns into a potato, like a raw potato. It's really not a good time. That's all. Another day.
All right, well, thanks so much, Ellie.
Thank you. And thank you guys for trying the beers.
We're just going to we need to get the other beers out, so we're just going to kind of try and slow things down briefly before we get into the Shambles beer, because otherwise we'll be talking about a beer we're not drinking.
Do we want to do some, like, jokes? Does anyone have a stand-up routine they want to try? No? You do?
I can see your cue cards there, Lindsay. Go for it.
Nick wants to do a stand-up routine?
I can see your cue cards. Go for it.
In a minute.
The beers will be coming out shortly. Do we have any other questions from the audience or online?
Yeah, it is our first time doing it with tap beers as well, so we're learning. And it's a lot of beers to pour, and it's a lot of beers for y'all to drink. So, we have an audience question. Or do you want to do a stand-up routine?
I'll start by saying this, that we're talking about our fathers being a father, using the tea bag over and over. Now, I'm not a tea bag fan myself, but there is a big difference between black tea and green tea. The green tea is much more able to be reused. So I just wonder if that must be the same with hops, but, well, I don't know if it must be, but is it? Could there be some hops, that are going to be so much better at this than others?
Well, I think, even just from this audience, I can't say better, but I can definitely say different. And I touched on it before, but there really is so many components in the hop oils, and they differ from different varieties to different varieties, and they also differ on how they are sort of detracted from during dry hop. There's been so many studies done that, you know, Centennial might use this much alpha acids and this much blah, 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 whereas Citra does something very different. So until we start trying it all and how people perceive it, I can't testify to that, but I know there is science about what is left behind by each different hop. So I think it's so much more intricate than, well, but I can't speak to green tea either, so.
The Shambles beers are coming out, but please don't drink them yet. Try and stop yourself from trying them, because we are going to try and perform a real-life experiment in the flesh.
Oh, that's very exciting.
So hold off. But we do have some questions coming in through online, which is exciting. Marty has asked what the dissolved oxygen in the 2 beers was.
In the 2 beers?
Yeah, was it different?
Oh, yeah.
You're really pulling at my memory now.
Marty, not me.
This was good 6 to 8 weeks ago, but we aim for a certain threshold because both these beers, I should mention, were spun through a centrifuge, and we actually have an inline carb with that centrifuge. So we then take a reading of dissolved oxygen and carb once it hits the bright tank before packaging. And I know that both these beers were under 30 parts per billion, so both within threshold, but I couldn't give you the exact specs on either of them, unfortunately.
But no obvious difference, though.
No, which was also hugely surprising, considering we're kind of double handling one, but because it was done in such quick succession of one another, so we transferred one under pressure of CO2, and we left that pressure in the tank while we transferred in with the old into it. So really there is no room for DO pickup or dissolved oxygen pickup, even though it got really transferred twice, so double the amount of times that the other one did.
Why is dissolved oxygen a problem in beer? Like, why would that be something someone would be wondering?
Dissolved oxygen is a huge problem in beer and a huge problem in packaged product. So if you've ever cracked a beer and it looks a kind of off brown colour, that is the effect of dissolved oxygen in beer. I mean, we try through many different processes to eliminate that from fermentation to packaged product. Because it basically gives the beer, well, in the case of hoppy beers, this very like papery sort of cardboardy, lackluster flavour. So a big fault that can happen in packaged beer.
Oxygen's just bad for everything, except for like breathing.
Except for like us,
like,
right?
Yeah, but it like ages you. I don't know. Oxygen's bad.
But
don't do it.
Oxygen's important at the start of the fermentation process.
Hugely important at the start. Yeah, those yeast babies need a whole lot of it, in fact. So it's that fine balance of getting enough in at the beginning and absolutely none at the end.
Yeah. We've got another question about the grams per litre as these beers get handed out. So what were the grams per litre of hops?
This was about 10 grams per litre for the initial, and then obviously whatever was absorbed or taken away from that first dry hop. So I can't speak to the exact amount that went into that second one, but it was just whatever was left over of solid matter in that trub of the fermenter.
Is that pretty standard for what you do, or did you do a little extra because you knew you'd have to make it go a little further?
It was honestly like exactly what we do
Standard.
for our... It was probably just slightly under our core pale. It's the only core beer we have at Range Brewing called Disco, and that's a double dry hop pale ale, but slightly more than what we do for like a mid-strength pale or just a straight pale ale.
Sure. All right.
How are the beers going? They're still going out, I think.
I think Nick wants to...
I've got a question.
Oh, go for it.
You mentioned a lot of breweries were looking at reusing hops for bitterness. and that doesn't make sense because you only use a little bit of hops for bitterness on small brews. Have
Yep.
you thought about using your reused hops in maybe the whirlpool or in mash hopping to get the thiols out of it?
Yeah, I have no experience in mash hopping, so I can't speak to that. And it's not something we've done at Range yet. But yeah, this whole experiment, like I said to Kelsey, has really opened up a whole multitude of other questions of where we can reuse it. The benefit of this experiment was that we didn't have to double handle those hops too much. We're not exposing them to oxygen. We're not carrying them from a fermenter in some form to the brew house, which is the only other thing that sort of sparks alarm bells in my mind. But if we can come up with a good plan for that, then absolutely. Whirlpool, yeah, let's do some West Coast IPAs with it and all sorts.
Questions are coming flying in online, which is great, but I can't keep up. Another question is about how you transfer the used hops over. How did you actually do that?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a confusing one. So we had two fermenters side by side, everything identical, brew, ingredients, knocked out, I think, an afternoon apart, so like 6 hours apart. One was brewed in the morning, one was brewed in the afternoon. So everything kind of tracked almost identically. Once they both finished ferment and they passed a test that we call a VDK test to ensure that it has passed, so it's finished ferment, we crash it down to 14 degrees to try and get any yeast cells out of that tank. We do that for 4 days, constantly pulling yeast out so that there's no potential for hop creep, which we talked about. And then dry hop the first one. And then there's bottom of the tank, and then there's one port above called the racking arm. And that has a lovely sort of scooped arm that sits up like this in the fermenter. So our idea was after we crash the tank, after dry hop, all that lovely solid hop material would sink to the bottom. We transferred that out with the new into a bright tank, leaving behind all that crashed solid material. And rather than transferring that into the second beer, we transferred that second beer through that hop matter to try and get some extra mixing, some rousing, and hop contact time. Yeah. And that's how we did it.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're getting close to having all the beers, so we can almost do this experiment. I think there's a few hazies here that need to go. Do you have a question about pushing it even further? Can you do it a third time? Can you recycle them a third time?
Oh,
How many
man.
times? How many generations of hops?
See, that's not even a question we got to yet, but now it is. Yeah, look, we'll give it a go, sure. But I think it would have to, thank you. We would definitely have to go for one of those higher hop ratio beers. So maybe a TDH or a DDH dipper, say, that has an enormous mass of hops in there to see if we could get a third iteration out of it. I would be interested to try and go a third round on something as small as like 8 to 10 grams per litre.
Someone didn't turn off their
Siri
phone.
didn't like me.
We've got another question online that says, could you reuse malt to make a lower ABV beer?
No. We've joked about using the final runnings of a mash. So the first bits of your mash that come through are obviously very high in sugar content. And as you're pulling it through to the next phase, it gets less and less concentrated. So we have joked about making a beer with that sort of end of it. But
It's a traditional way of brewing. It's called Partagal brewing.
go.
So in England, they would brew a strong beer, a medium beer, and a weak beer. and they would just take the runnings from the first and put it in one tank. They take the runnings from the middle and put it in another tank, and then they take the final beer and they make the table beer. And they'd be, I don't know, like 8%, 4%, 2%.
So it's all the same mash.
All the same mash,
but
yeah.
just the different stages of runnings.
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, that makes sense.
Partaguile.
Partaguile. But you
Incredible.
wouldn't ever really like re-mash a grain bed, would you?
No,
No.
you'd
Not
be
on purpose.
extracting heaps of weird tannins and
Right,
the
yeah.
pH would be pretty wacky. So
Yeah.
I don't think it'd.
By the time you finish with spent grain, there's no sugar left in it.
Yeah, well,
it's
ideally,
pretty
no
much
sugar.
all the way gone, and the grain that comes out is protein and like
Yeah.
fiber.
And husks and stuff like that. Yeah.
So
Like-
there's nothing much left in there. It's great for cows because it's got fiber and protein. It's good
Absolutely.
for cows, but not much sugar left in there.
Whereas like with the hops, what people have been finding and the experiments they're doing on it, there is so much still left in those hops in terms of alpha acids and oils left over, which is why it sort of sparks this question of can we reuse them and keep getting more and more out of them?
Yeah, I think the studies have shown that there's a dissolved limit to the amount that each beer can take up of each essential oil. So there's a threshold that a saturation point. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Henry. Saturation point that each beer can have that they can only absorb a certain amount of each essential oil. So they're very clearly there's a lot left over.
Yeah.
All right, I think everyone's itching to try the next beer. So before you do, we're going to try and do a little experiment, and then I'll get Henry to explain it as we do the experiment. But basically what we want you to do is close your eyes, get your partner or someone else to kind of switch the beers up so you don't know which one's which, and have a taste of them.
Oh, that's
what-
fun.
And what we want you to do is see if you can work out which one is the hazy one.
And no peeking.
No peeking, and we'll get a show of hands at the end. So please do that. Make sure you don't know which one's which.
Yep.
All right.
It's really full to do that.
Okay. Give me the other one. I love this. This is great fun. I'm having a
Okay, I'm
good
going to
time.
try.
Do I get to try the other one, or do I have to make a call now? No, I get to try the other one, right?
That one's the hazy.
Try and do this at home too if you can.
Try both.
What?
Yeah, we get to try both. Okay.
Try both.
Yeah, so Lindsay didn't
I
get
am
it.
shook. I did not get it. I'm actually shook.
Second hazy.
one. Oh, hey.
That's what
You got
It's
it.
totally a guess though. It's totally a guess.
What?
Taste
Close
it.
your eyes. I know, but like, are you really that good at it now?
All right. Hopefully everyone's done the experiment by now.
Hold on, Henry hasn't.
Henry's doing. Okay, the brewer.
Henry's
the
doing
brewer
it.
is doing it.
Close your eyes. You're keeping your eyes closed. I don't know if I trust you. Okay,
You want me to do it for you
Well,
now?
the first time we did this experiment, I didn't get it right. So
great, cool. You're about to spill it as well, so be careful.
I'm going to say the first one was the hazy.
Neither of them were. I fucked with you.
Oh, that's cheating. You said I'm not allowed to peek, and then you done me like that.
Sorry.
Very good, very good.
Can we get a show of hands? Who got it right? Oh, fair few. Who didn't get it right? Fair few as well, yeah. Did you get it right out of luck, or was it a guess, or did you actually know?
That had.
Well, weirdly,
Yeah,
Tastes
little bit.
different.
Okay, interesting.
the hazy,
All right, so
one of them over attenuated.
this is the control and the experiment by Shambles. Henry
Yes.
Tanner,
Yes.
can you tell us here what the experiment was, what you were hoping to answer, what you brewed?
I guess, yeah, we kind of had two questions. The main question was, does haze impact flavour, aroma, mouthfeel? Does it make a better beer? And then to get to that conclusion, we had to try and clarify a hazy. So it was kind of a two-prong. Usually when you make a hazy, you throw a lot of proteins, a lot of hops. You select a certain yeast that helps haze. So then doing that and then trying to remove the haze was also a bit of a challenge. So Yeah, we brewed literally 2 traditional NEPAs, like low bitterness, extremely heavy dry hop. I think it was about 22 grams a litre. Thanks to HPA for that. And then, yeah, the idea was to basically... So like they came out, before we clarified them, they came out identical in tank. They looked the same. They both, one slightly attenuated a bit more than the other. I can't remember off the top of my head which one.
Quickly, can you just clarify what that means?
Oh, one ended up basically over fermenting. So one's slightly higher ABV than the other one. But yeah, basically, yeah, the gist of it was, does it impact flavour? And from what I guess it was about a 50-50 split here. I got stitched up and drunk the clear one twice, but we did a blind test the day we packaged. There was 15 people here. We had 3 cans. Was it 2 with hazy, 1 with the clear? And basically sat down, no peeking. Can you pick the clear one? And 3 out of 15 got it. And there was 6-7 brewers, people that judge beer, a few other stuff and stuff like that. So it was a mixed bag, and yeah, Cornell did some maths on it, and there was a p-value that wasn't significant. I'm not sure what that meant. Basically, it's like statistically, it was not impossible, but statistically, it was hard to pick. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I couldn't tell the difference. I guessed and got it right. And I think that was the thing with having only 2 beers is there's a 50-50, whereas when you got that 3-beer experiment, much more
having
difficult.
the third one there definitely spices it up a bit. But
3 7%ers is pushing it.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess maybe starting off, something that I've always wondered, everyone knows a hazy beer when we see one, and we can see one here compared to this clear, bright beer. It's cloudy, it's foggy, like a big glass of juice, but what actually is haze from a chemistry point of view?
Well, luckily I have a Bachelor of Business, but I'll try my best. So basically there's 3 types of haze from my understandings. You've got a solution, which is basically if a molecule is small enough to dissolve. So an example of this would be pouring a teaspoon of sugar into some hot water. The molecules of sugar don't disappear. They dissolve and disperse between the water molecules. I think this is the understanding of it. And then there's colloids. Colloids? Colloids. Back myself. And basically a colloid is where the particle isn't big enough to dissolve, but isn't also small enough. No, it's other way around. Not small enough to dissolve, but not big enough to drop out of suspension. An example of this would be milk. So that's why it's opaque. And then the third one is a suspended solid. And a suspended solid is big enough to basically hang around for a bit, but if it sits still in conditions long enough, it will drop out. That's technically, but in terms of beer, there's a whole lot of chemistry going on. I'm not 100% around all of it, but a lot of it is to do with your yeast, your hops, and your malt. Basically, you want malts with lots of proteins, and then you just dry hop the living hell out of it to get polyphenols. And the haze that forms is a polyphenol protein complex, which binds together and looks like that.
So you mentioned, some of the ingredients that are key in creating a hazy beer, but is there other haze that can form in beers that might not be as desirable? Yeah, there is. There's different. So there's biological and non-biological. Non-biological. Well, I guess a hazy would be a combination of both, because a biological haze is something yeast derived. Non-biological would be malt derived. There's also certain things there's a thing called chill haze, which is basically a haze that appears only when the beer is at a certain temperature. As the temperature drops, proteins and polyphenols bond together to form a haze. And if that haze isn't removed and then the beer warms back up, it'll dissolve. There is an issue though, if you warm up a beer and cool it down too many times, those bonds become stronger and stronger each time they break and reform. And then eventually it'll become permanent haze, which is, not good. Basically, permanent haze can lead to
your beer staling quicker. It oxidises and other things like that. Obviously, it doesn't look pleasant as well. It's a different type of haze to what we've got here, though.
Yeah, and so I guess, speaking of haze as being an undesirable trait, which, it was for a long time because most beers wanted to be bright, except you're brewing like a wheat beer or something like that, traditional. But how do we end up here where so many beers are hazy? Like, what was the history of the haze hype?
It's a bit of an interesting one. Me and Cornell were actually talking about this the other day, and I tried to do a bit of research and stuff and figure it out. It looks like haze can kind of... Yeah, it's weird. So when craft breweries kicked off, they started messing around with lots of different malts and different dry hopping. Like, traditional breweries don't really dry hop. They add hops in the hot side, in the kettle, but not actually in fermenter. And with all these new techniques and new ingredients and stuff like that, beers became a lot more flavourful. And I guess smaller breweries had less capacity or less ability to remove that haze. And maybe it's not psychosomatic, but it kind of normalised haze to be attached to more flavour.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I think, but I'm not 100% sure.
Makes
what
sense.
do you guys think?
Heady Topper in the US.
Heady
was
Topper,
kind of
yeah, is
the,
from Vermont.
The forefront, right? It was like,
2000 and early 2000s, I think.
Yeah, and it was during the Wales Bro phase. It was like, are you gonna drive hours to get this beer that's only good to drink for like a week?
A week, and then it's...
And don't pour it in a glass. 'cause
Don't
it's
pour it in a
ugly.
glass.
It's
Yeah, because it's not great.
It
but
looks like orange juice.
Drink it from the can.
Yeah,
it's
and you're
literally on the
gonna
can.
travel because it doesn't distribute in other states, and you're gonna stand in a line for 2 days, camp.
Yeah.
Americans love camping
They
in
do love
lines.
camping out. That's
Yeah,
commitment.
definitely. Like a lot of the haze craze filtered down from America, didn't it?
Yeah,
And,
America kind of sets the trends, and we kind of follow suit.
and they had these hype breweries, like you said, that camping out the door, and they're using more and
Fresh is
more
best.
of these amazing hops and getting these amazing aroma and fruity profiles that then was tied to a hazy look. So
Yeah.
As an advocate for yeast, I will put my hand up here and say that the haze craze was started by the use of new yeasts.
yeah.
Without these yeasts that were different from the yeast that used to be used, USO5, California Ale,
Yeah.
you're thinking Sierra Nevada, Stone and Wood, Little Creatures, clean, kind of crisp beers, and then the Heady Toppers came through and they started using slightly obscure English yeasts, and these
Low
yeasts were
flop,
less attenuative. So they would create hazes in the beer, and they also took the amazing hops. When they put more and more and more in, these yeasts took those amazing hops and they did biotransformation, which is like a fun catchphrase. But they would grab onto the different parts of the hop compounds in there and create brand new flavour compounds that weren't in any of the hops to start with. So I'm gonna vote for yeast here and say that yeast did hazy beer because I love yeast.
that was a question I was going to ask, actually. Say if I made a beer with the same malt bill I've done here, but used something like USO5, which is a standard ale yeast that flocks quite well, would it still be hazy? Probably, just because the amount of protein's in there, or...
Not as hazy.
Not as
Yeah,
hazy?
I've done this
Yeah.
experiment
Yeah,
with
same.
1028 with a London Ale and USO5, and
Okay.
and they're not as hazy, but you can still get. I mean, it depends on filtration or whatever. But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can
But
still
it wouldn't
get
taste the same because
doesn't
yeast
taste the
is
same,
the
no.
most important ingredient in beer.
Absolutely.
We just went on a tangent. Nick did.
What I've realised I've forgotten to do is pass to Lindsay, though, for the snack pairing.
Oh, snacks.
Oh yeah, it goes with cheese. I was just hoping that everybody was watching me snack on my cheese. So the cheese that you have is Havarti with water crackers. I think a plain cheese like this, right? It's not really going to contribute a lot of flavor, but for me, when I first had these beers, I actually thought there was they were a little bit drier and there was a little more bitterness. So once again, I do a lot of snack pairings with lovely HPA, and I'm always trying to emphasize the hop characters and the fruitiness of the beers. And cheese is a really good way to kind of eliminate some of the bitterness with the creaminess of the cheese, bring out some more fruitiness. And the water cracker there is also just there for support, like a really plain cracker that kind of blends in with the pale malt in the beer. But yeah, once again, try that with both of them, and then try it with the kettle chip because it's fine.
You really don't like kettle chips?
No, I love them. They're great for dips. I
Yeah,
just
okay.
they're great for dips. Why are you looking at me like that?
I don't dip kettle chips.
You don't put this in like a green onion dip or like a French onion dip or like a kiwi
chips are
onion
for
dip.
I have never.
Chips are chips. They've got everything they need. You know?
This is another day, another time.
Now we're just going to start talking
I'm
about
with
chips.
Lindsay here.
I'm not.
Chips and dip.
Dip
For the win.
What?
Yeah.
Sorry. That's the snack pairing.
Anyway, thanks, Lindsay. So in this experiment, you're hoping to debunk the myth that haze is required to make, as stupid as it sounds, a good hazy IPA. What are the supposed benefits of haze? What does it do for, or reportedly do for impact and aroma?
Yeah, see, that's one of the things we're trying to get to the root of. My main guess is you kind of drink with your eyes. So you see a hazy beer, you automatically think, oh, it's going to be super fruity, super tropical. But a lot of people say it helps mouthfeel. The only other thing, a lot of hazy beers use different types of salting in the mash or in the kettle. So they usually ramp up your calcium chloride. Your calcium chloride is a salt that promotes mouthfeel and promotes maltiness, while they keep their calcium sulfate low, which is usually more for pronouncing bitterness and hop expression. So I think a lot of the haze might, not the haze itself, but the flavour that you get from a hazy could also be attributed to the salt used in brewing them.
Water profile? No.
No chance.
That unsexy topic?
Yeah, I think that was last year's topic.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
Cornell made that very sexy last year. It's all good.
But yeah, I guess, yeah, our experiment or our tasting of 15 people proved that haze didn't impact flavour. The main thing we were kind of worried though is the extra processing, but I guess we'll get to that bit in a second.
Yeah, that's the next question. So don't.
Oh, perfect.
But before we go to how you removed the haze,
Yes.
you know, why would brewers typically want to remove haze? Like,
Yep.
what are the impacts, the negative impacts, I guess, of haze on a beer?
Probably the main one would be shelf life. The more solids you got in a beer, the more polyphenols you got floating around, the more chance there is for them to oxidise and to give off papery, dirty notes, stuff like that. And I think traditionally beer would have originally been pretty murky when beer first came about. And then over the years, as people changed their techniques, cold conditioning, stuff like that, beer eventually would have got more and more clear. And associated with that clearer beer was probably a cleaner, crisper type of finish. So I think trends have a lot to do with it. And then obviously technology kind of evolved so we can, rather than cold condition a beer for a month, you can clarify a beer quite quickly. But I guess that's about it.
So yeah, like these two beers, the exact same recipe, but somehow you managed to make this beer look like this, even though it was hazy at one point.
Yeah.
So how exactly did you do that? What methods did you use? And can you kind of give a brief kind of explanation of how those methods might work?
Yes, so there's a few different methods you can use for clarifying beer. There's finings you can use, hot side, which is in the brew house. You can use things like Whirlfloc or PVPP, which go into the kettle and attract proteins and polyphenols. And then the idea is that as they sink to the bottom, and then you don't transfer them into the fermenter. Another way is through filtration. It's basically just putting a liquid through something and it catches all of the gunk. Not that, yeah. I don't know how else to explain
Like a shower
that.
plug or something.
Yeah. But there's different
But very
ways.
fine.
There's different ways of filtration. There's earth filtration. There's lenticular filtration using candles. All these type of things. And then the third would be, I guess, just sedimentation, letting a beer sit, conditioning it at cold temperatures. Lagering. And then using a centrifuge. Basically, a centrifuge is the same principle as sedimentation, it just speeds it up. So you've got a centrifuge bowl, it's got all these plates spinning around at, I don't know, about 10,000 RPM, roughly. More? 12? 13? Okay, yours is quicker than our one. And the idea is your beer goes in and centrifugal force splits all the solids away and they get ejected out and your clear beer comes out the other end. But what we did for this one was the hazy beer, we basically used no stabilisers, no beta-glucanase, which is used in the mash tun, none of that stuff. Put it through the centrifuge. So we put it through the centrifuge to take most of the yeast out of it. And then the second one, we put in kettle finings at about 3 times the normal rate. The idea there was to attract as much proteins as we could. And then in the bright tank, once we dropped it to 4 degrees, I think, we put in biofine, which is basically silicic acid, I think. It also attracts proteins and polyphenols together. It makes them form larger clumps. And then we sent it through the centrifuge. Unfortunately, it didn't work that great the first time we did it, so we had to do it again.
The double centrifuge.
Yeah, double centrifuge, which, yeah.
Put that on the label.
I don't know if that's a selling point, but yeah, the more times you process things, the more risk there is exposing it to oxygen or doing something wrong potentially, or just ruining the beer. So yeah, it was after the first centrifuge, I was a bit worried, but we got there in the end. So yeah, pretty happy with the end product.
It's incredible, and it's incredible. Were you worried about it changing? Because this beer was brewed maybe a month ago. Like, were you worried that it might age faster or slower, or the?
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. I guess because there's less sediment in it. In theory, it should age better, but I guess I was worried that the extra processing might affect it. But it's held up very well. So yeah.
Yes. Cool.
The hazy one's got more foam on it, which is kind of the opposite of what I normally see. Is hazy beers struggle a little bit for foam, and clearer beers generally have a bigger foam on them.
Yeah.
As the opposite way around. Do you have any thoughts on that?
My only guess would be we removed foam-positive proteins in the process of transferring and centrifuging. There is certain finings you can use that apparently don't attract foam-positive proteins, but I don't think that's true. But yeah, I guess the extra processing probably knocked a bit of the head out of it. And once foam's created, and if it's destroyed, you can never get it back. It's gone.
So I guess, what's your verdict from the experiment? Is haze required to make a good hazy IPA?
Technically, yes, I guess, because then it's not a hazy. I don't know. It's interesting. I think you could brew a clear beer that is super fruity and super tropical by just utilising different malts and a different yeast strain. I think the issue might be, as Nick said, the yeast does play a big factor in flavour. Whether there's certain strains out there, we're not privy to them over here in Australia, but there's GMO yeast that they're using in America that are potentially unlocking certain thiols and doing all this wacky scientific stuff. So you can maybe look to that in the future, but yeah, I don't think haze is needed. But yeah, like I said, half the time you drink with your eyes.
Do you think it's worth the effort that you went to centrifuging it twice?
Definitely not. No, there was a few sleepless nights for sure. It was a fun experiment, and it was very interesting to do, but I would not recommend it. No.
Do we have any questions from the audience? We have a hand up.
I have a statement and a question.
This will be good.
So I reckon your tasting panel was kind of rubbish, because to me, I think the hazy beer has like a really clear, like astringent hop bite.
It's definitely got a bit more bite to it, yeah.
That you often get in hazies and not really in clear IPAs.
Yeah, okay. I guess the only thing would be we did the test the day it was canned.
Yeah.
So maybe as the hazy's aged, it's gotten a bit more bitey. But yeah, that'd be.
That was also a joke if I know any of the people that were on the panel. But yeah, like where sort of does that bite come from?
Yeah, traditionally you bite like that is, from my experience, usually yeast. It's a kind of bitterness at the back of your mouth, and that's usually a yeast bite. But We did centrifuge it. We centrifuged it pretty slow to try and rip out as much as we could. So there could be more residual yeast in there that we didn't capture.
We've got a question online while Ollie goes over there. But what hops were used in the beer?
So this had a bit of Enigma and a bit of Strata in the Whirlpool. I think it was about 1.5 kilos all up, so pretty light. And then we did a 5 kilo Day Zero dry hop. So Day Zero dry hop is where you basically knock out into the tank, you pitch your yeast, and then you throw a big bag of hops right on top of it. Traditionally, you usually wait for your ferment to start, but yeah, a lot of Ali would know about this. A lot of hazy breweries it's finding a lot of success with Day Zero dry hops. You get a lot different aromas and a lot more fruity tropical notes. Biotransformation, that click word. But in the dry hop, we use Galaxy, Citra, and Vic Secret. So nearly the same as yours.
All right, I've got a question in the audience. Is the mic on? Hello.
Hello.
It shouldn't be off.
We're back. You talked about drinking with your eyes.
Yes.
And I was just picking up on that. So I don't know if it's an older guy thing, but I'm here with my dad tonight, who's the oldest man in the room. And he... Anyway, I agree with him. Like, we love the look of the clear beer. So drinking with your eyes, to me, I'm going the clear beer over the hazy.
Yeah.
I just wonder if we could have a show of hands. Does anybody prefer the hazy look to the clear? It's an old person thing then, okay, no worries.
Yeah. If you're drinking a hazy IPA, yes.
That depends what I'm drinking.
Yeah, it's all style
Sure.
based. Yeah, it can be very style based. But yeah, I get what you mean. Like, if you're not used to it, and I guess like I was alluding to before, it is trend based. But I don't think Cascade's going to turn around and make a macro beer that's hazy at any point. Yeah.
Hazy Heineken.
Ooh, now we're onto something. Hazy Heineken. That green
Hazy,
glass. That'll
hazy
look
Corona
fantastic.
as well in the clear bottle so that you can just really see it. Extra Tetra hop. Just
Love it. Bit of skunk in there, why not?
it won't because it's Tetra hop. They have the money.
All right. Do we have another question? And then we might go to an intermission after this one.
Good. Okay. Yeah, that works. I don't know if, like, obviously you talked about previously that the testing didn't actually come out that conclusive. My wife and I, we picked it straight up.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I'm also interested. I'm talking to hearing a lot about American beers, and my wife and I have just lived in America for 2 years. Please don't.
I won't. Don't worry.
Yeah, why?
That's not a question. It's just a statement.
Thank you.
So. Yeah, no. But yeah, no, that was a very interesting experiment. So
yeah, thank you.
Not so much a question, but a statement. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
A lot of statements coming through the question panel.
Could you do this? I mean, you could do it again because the beer's on tap, so you could actually pour it into dark cups.
Yeah.
Or like blacked out cups or cans or whatever for every. Well, not tonight, but like eventually you could run the experiment again now that they've had time to age and settle out.
Yeah, definitely. It'd be interesting to see. I think, yeah, they've kind of not grown apart, but they've definitely aged differently. Yeah, I don't know. There is a thing called can shock, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when a beer's freshly canned, it's kind of just gone through a pretty traumatic process. It's happily sitting in a tank and it's just been shot through some pipes and ejected into a can. Yeah, it's just screaming the whole time. So whether that had an effect on it, but yeah, from the experiment we did on fresh beer, it was. Yeah, like we said, 3 and 15. Yeah.
I don't know how Lindsay knows that, but that's what happens in my head every time a beer gets canned.
He's just screaming inside.
All right, we better go to intermission because we're behind schedule, but it doesn't really matter. So we'll be back in probably 10 to 15 minutes. So go to the toilet, don't eat all your snacks, and we'll be back with the last beer.
Yeah, and if anyone's got any other questions, feel free to just come grab us and chat.
See you soon.
We're not that scary.
Don't eat your caramel crown. There are no more left in the building, so if you eat yours, you're going to have to go down the street and buy more.
And on that day, an epic event occurred that cast a long and delicious haze across the land. Eclipse was born. Eclipse is a new addition to the spectrum of Aussie flavour hops from the country's leading grower, HPA.
And from the bountiful hop gardens of Australia, an enticing beauty emerged. Magic with Ella, another spellbinding Aussie flavour hop from the country's leading grower, HPA.
You can now savour the Aussie flavour, enjoyed by beer fans whose tastes are braver. A sweet sour gem that tastes of lychee and tropical fruits. Brewers all agree. Exotic, fragrant, grounded in earth, creates a beer that's award-worthy. Shine bright with topaz that dazzles. HPA grown from brewers to bottle.
Auntie Carol likes big things. Big hair, big colours, big sunnies. Now she's setting off on holidays to discover her favourite big beer flavour. It's not big banana or big cherry. It's certainly not big prawn or big penguin. And no one enjoys fermented sheep. Auntie Carol's discovered that big beer flavour is a secret. Vic secret. It's big on pine. It's big on pine apple. And it tastes like holidays. Thanks, Auntie Carol. Now we know. Discover Vic Secret, another great Aussie flavour hop from the country's leading grower, HPA.
Malt is the soul of every great beer and whiskey, and I think we often forget that these products start in the ground. Our families have been farming here in the Riverina for generations, and I guess it was just a natural progression, especially with myself and Brad and our passion for craft beer and spirits, to really want to be able to showcase the high quality grains that our families have been growing here in the region. We started Voyager to put that spotlight back on the farm and farmer, producing high quality, single origin artisan malts for craft brewers and distillers. We're really proud of the way in which we've innovated and brought the sustainable practices employed on our farm through to the custom design of our malt house. All our wastewater is able to be reused back to irrigate local crops. We've worked extensively with product designers to develop our biodegradable malt bags, and we're also utilising a fully sustainable carbon neutral heat source to kiln all of our malts. We're doing this through our integration with a biochar facility, which is turning local agricultural byproducts, things such as walnut shells and rice hulls, into biochar, which is an organic charcoal-based product that we're then able to utilise back into our soils to improve the quality of future crops. This approach is seeing us create the most sustainably produced malt in the world, right here on farm, and that's something that we're extremely proud of. One of the most rewarding aspects of malting for us is our collaboration with other farmers, brewers and distillers. We get really excited about the subtle differences we can recognise in different varieties that have been produced under different conditions, and we're passionate about how these differences impact on the final product. And to be able to share that journey with other artisans is such a great experience. Craft beer and spirits are a product of agriculture, provenance and also the people that craft them, and we're really proud and excited to play a part in this.
Strap in. Load hop cannon. Activate beer radar. Engage afterburners. Ready to play. Galaxy. Reach for the stars with Galaxy, another high-scoring Aussie flavour hub from the country's leading grower, HPA.
And on that day, an epic event occurred that cast a long and delicious haze across the land. Eclipse was born. Eclipse is a new addition to the spectrum of Aussie flavour hops from the country's leading grower, HPA.
And from the bountiful hop gardens of Australia, an enticing beauty emerged. Magic with Ella, another spellbinding Aussie flavour hop from the country's leading grower, HPA.
Savour, the Aussie flavour, enjoyed by beer fans whose tastes are braver. A sweet sour gem that tastes of lychee and tropical fruits. Brewers all agree. Exotic, fragrant, grounded in earth, creates a beer that's award-worthy. Shine bright with topaz that dazzles. HPA grown from brewers to bottle.
Auntie Carol likes big things. Big hair, big colours, big sunnies. Now she's setting off on holidays to discover her favourite big beer flavour. It's not big banana or big cherry. It's certainly not big prawn or big penguin. And no one enjoys fermented sheep. Auntie Carol's discovered that big beer flavour is a secret. Vic secret. It's big on pine. It's big on pine apple. And it tastes like holidays. Thanks, Auntie Carol. Now we know. Discover Vic Secret, another great Aussie flavour hop from the country's leading grower, HPA.
Malt is the soul of every great beer and whiskey, and I think we often forget that these products start in the ground. Our families have been farming here in the Riverina for generations, and I guess it was just a natural progression, especially with myself and Brad and our passion for craft beer and spirits, to really want to be able to show
All right. I think we're back. We're back. We're back, everyone. So we might take a little bit of hush. We're live. We're being watched. So we need to talk.
Are you smiling at me?
Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't tell if you were looking at me or looking past there.
I'm looking at the panel.
Okay. I can't tell. Half of your face is shaded. No idea.
Anyway, we're back. We're back from the intermission with the last beer. Lindsay?
Yes. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I will. Great. So first, I'm just going to let you know that the caramel crown will go with the Dubbel. I actually don't know which is which as far as the rubber band.
The rubber band is Adorned. The Dubbel, Belgian Dubbel.
Cool.
So it's Adorned.
Cool, perfect. Right, so in the experiments that we've had so far, we've had major focus on hop aromas and flavors, compounds, rah. Nick from Molly Rose has already given us a little tangent about his love for yeast, which would make sense why he decided to go the yeast route. Nick?
It was a teaser.
It was a teaser. You were just getting everybody's appetite ready for the conversation we're about to have. Nick, do you want to go ahead and kind of let us know what you did with this beer? So this beer is the same wort, but different yeast strains. So do you want to talk a little bit about those yeast strains and why you chose them?
Yeah, sure. So when Lindsay says the same word, it means we mashed grains and we boiled the kettle, and then we took that and split it between two tanks. So this is exactly the same base, split between two tanks. And we pitched different yeasts into different tanks. I love yeast, and I love to keep yeast happy, because happy yeast means happy beer. And so at our brewery, we've actually got these dish bottom fermenters. And so that's the closest we can get to it in our tiny, small brewery, closest we can get to open fermentation. Because open fermentation happens in Belgian breweries and English breweries and German breweries. And we're not talking about cool ships and catching wild yeast. We're talking about letting the yeast be happy and not having oppressive tanks pushing down on top of them. So normal tanks are quite tall and the liquid pushes right down on the yeast. These are broad tanks, and so the yeast has lots of room to kind of bubble up anything out of it, and there's no pressure down on that yeast. So these two tanks were specifically designed to make yeast happy. I chose two different yeast strains. One's a lager yeast, and lagers are known for being crisp and clean and kind of letting malt and hops do all the work, and they hide in the background. And I chose a Belgian yeast, and Belgian yeasts are the exact opposite, and they like put on a top hat and do a little dance.
Kind of like you. I guess maybe we should rewind. Let's rewind. So what is yeast, and what role does it actually play in beer?
Should ask that one first.
I know. You know, it was actually in my notes, and I just decided to go off.
Off-piste.
Yeah.
So yeast is the microorganism that eats sugar and creates CO2 and alcohol. And so if you've ever seen in a brewery or at someone's home brew during a fermentation, the bubbling, the magic bubbling, you're like, oh, thank goodness it's fermenting. The bubbles coming out, that's the CO2 coming out. And so the yeast is eating the sugar and also making alcohol and CO2, and also a lot of flavor compounds too, but they're the main things.
Yeah, it's like yeast farts.
It is yeast farts.
Are the bubbles.
Yeah.
Kind of, but not really.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm okay with that.
It's way more fun that way.
Yeah.
Right, so yeast is responsible for making alcohol by eating all the sugar.
Eats the sugar, makes alcohol, but also makes flavor compounds too. Yeast was discovered as an ingredient in beer only about 1850, I think. And that's when Louis Pasteur kind of figured out that there was a microorganism fermenting things. Before that, they kind of thought that it was magic. They called it, in Germany, they called it God is great. And it's like they just thought magic was happening and beer was being created. And the Germans actually, like the Reinheitsgebot that the Germans stick by was only malt and hops and water. They didn't have yeast in there. So from 1850 onwards, they were like, oh, there's another ingredient. It's really important.
Some breweries actually had a magic stick as well that they would put into, like, from one beer to another beer. It was the Magic Stick,
Yeah,
also a very famous song made by 50 Cent, I think, about the same thing, I'm sure.
Really?
But back to yeast. It was a stand-up. I am doing my own
just
stand-up.
quickly
sorry.
before we keep going on, just so
Yeah.
everyone in the room is clear of which beer is which.
Yes.
The Adorned, which is the Belgian Dubbel, is this one with the rubber band on it, and without the rubber band is the other beer that I've forgotten its name.
Is
What's
the,
name?
the
It's a
Bock.
Bock, but what is it called?
Polished.
Polished.
Um,
It's a lager, the Bock.
You just catch Lindsay and I from talking crap.
Yeah.
So before you get too
Yes.
stuck into drinking the beers,
talk
I just
about
want to point out one of the really, really, really coolest things about it. Before you have a sip, look at the foam on top between the two beers. It is drastically different. The colour of the foam. Like, one is like tanny brown and the other is pure white. It's the same work. The ingredients are the same. The only thing different is a living organism. That's the coolest thing I've ever fucking seen.
Nick, why did we choose? So with these two yeast strains, right? We're talking about a Belgian yeast strain and we're talking about a German yeast strain. But what does that actually mean? Like, what were you expecting to get out of the Belgian yeast strain? Like, how do these two strains differ?
Yeah, so the lager strain, the German strain, I was really trying to get it to sit in the background and let the malt come forwards and let those kind of caramelly, raisiny malt characters come forwards and that little bit of hop bitterness kind of carry through and finish. On the Belgian beer, what I wanted was the malts to kind of sink in with these amazing flavors that the yeast create. So the yeast creates phenols and esters and a bunch of other interesting characters that can blend in with the caramel toffee note.
Phenols and esters.
Yes.
Let's break that down. So phenols and esters are compounds, but that actually translates to flavors. So what kind of flavors are we expecting to get?
So the phenols will be clovey, black pepper, that type of flavor. And then the esters can be pear, apple, banana. That's what I kind of generally get from this yeast strain.
And then as far as yeast-derived flavors in the German strain, were you expecting anything from this as far as, like, or was this purely supposed to be malt-focused?
I wasn't expecting anything
Yeah.
from it. No.
Yeah, okay.
With no expectation.
What do you get
Do you
from
get
Lindsay?
anything? No, I'm just wondering if you get anything.
Not particularly. I get like a bready maltiness that I don't get out of the Belgian, but it's really hard to tell if that's because the yeast strain of the lager yeast is throwing that character or because it's not hidden by the phenols and the esters, the really sweet character from the Belgian.
Yeah, so when we think of lager strains, right, we normally think of paler malt bases. I think as well, a lot of times when we think of Belgian beers, sometimes we think of like darker, I'm thinking of Delirium Nocturum, or like, with this beer, is there any particular reason you decided to go with a darker malt base? Instead of something light like a Pilsner, something clear?
The first reason was it's winter and we're in Tasmania. And also, I live in Melbourne, so like that's cold too. And I wanted to choose a base beer that could showcase perfectly and show off the characteristics of each yeast. Because what I wanted to show is two excellent examples of a beer. And so I wanted the malt bill to be great and perfect for a Dubbel, and I wanted it to be great and perfect for a Bock, or great and perfect for two different beers. And so I chose those beers that I knew I could brew one base beer, and it would be awesome. And so that we could then have a look at it and see the difference. And so instead of compromising on malt for a specific style of beer and going, oh, it's kind of okay for that, but it's awesome for that. I think the malt bill is perfect for both of these beers.
Yeah.
And we could look at things like the foam and go, holy fuck, that foam is tan brown and that foam is white. How has that happened? It's the same beer. And we can look at it and go, well, the mouthfeel on this one is completely different. The carbonation texture is different.
Yeah.
And it's all because of a living organism that we put into the tank.
Why is the foam different colour?
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing.
I don't know.
Because of the yeast.
It's got to be the yeast.
The yeast.
I have zero idea.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, to be honest.
It is completely fascinating. I know anecdotally that yeast plays a huge role in mouthfeel, it plays a huge role in texture, plays a huge role in how foam even looks, whether it's bubbly, whether it's creamy, whether it's tight, whether it's thick. And that's all about the foam-positive proteins, but the yeast is creating or enabling those proteins. And I don't know, because we've got thousands of yeast strains that we can use. So the only examples I've got are anecdotal. Unfortunately, I
have a question about strains, because you're saying you use 2 different strains, but really you use 2 different species of yeast. I'm a zoologist, so I love this stuff. But, so essentially, lager yeast, what is it, Saccharomyces pastorina, I'm going to say that wrong, and ale yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which I'm saying wrong as well. But they're different species, but you also have different strains within those species. Why do you think that these, like, what drives these differences in the profiles that you can get from different strains, like, say, a Hefeweizen versus a pale ale, which is still an ale yeast, still an ale species?
It's a really, really good question. It's a hard one to describe. Yeast is a living organism. So it wants to grow, and it needs to eat things to grow, and then it needs to make different parts. So yeast cells to reproduce, they don't couple like humans, they bud. So you got a yeast cell like that, and it forms a little bubble off the side, and then it'll burst off, and it'll form a new cell. And so to do that, it actually needs to create the matter to create that new cell out of what's around it. And so if it doesn't have that in the beer, what it'll do is do a whole bunch of processes inside of the yeast cell and spit out any of the waste products. And those waste products that it spits out are kind of the flavour profile that we get in different yeast strains.
So we're drinking yeast waste.
We're drinking yeast waste. We are 100% drinking yeast waste.
Farts, as I think Lindsay put it.
Yeah. I actually wrote that on my Cicerone exam. I just to bring the audience's attention in a little bit, because there's a lot of excitement and chatter, which is understandable. I think we all get really hyped up about yeast, and how can we not when Nick is so excited about it. So everyone has the caramel crown. I'm first of all, so proud of y'all for not eating it yet. I'm not going to tell you which beer I originally paired this with out of these 2. I want you to try the caramel crowns with both beer, and then after it's all over, we'll have a vote on which worked better, because we all want to do a little bit of an experiment, right? So Nick,
just looking.
do you see a different, like, do you want to tell us about what you're looking at? Because your fascination with the color and the foam color, like the excitement is just so tangible. But as well, the lacing I notice on your glass, to me, there's a difference. I don't know if that's a controlled, maybe it's in my head.
What's lacing quickly?
So
even that's a...
Yeah, does everybody here know what lacing is on a glass? Yeah? It's actually a sign of a good glass, but it's a sign of like a well-made beer. It's a sign that the beer has been made well. There's proteins in it, which are leaving that nice, beautiful... you actually have a beautiful glass. Both of you do, if you want to hold it up. You see that lovely lace. Show off your glass. Yeah. Beautiful lacing. It's a sign of a very good beer, but also applause for Nick as well. I thought I noticed a difference between the 2, maybe more on the one with the band on it.
The Belgian.
Yeah.
Ale.
Yeah. Which is what I would expect. But did you expect to see this kind of difference in the color, in the foam?
I 100% expected to see a difference, and that's really why I wanted to do this, to closely inspect the two beers. I thought there'd be a slight difference in the colour of the beer as well, which is a really weird thing to think about. It's like, why is a yeast cell taking colour out of a beer? But it totally happens. I've seen it happen before. It's hard because one of them's got a bit more haze in it than the other one, so it's really hard to tell. Yeah, I think the number one thing is the difference in the foam. That's a good one. And you think about all of the ingredients in that beer, all of them except for the yeast are exactly the same. And I think if you put those beers side by side on the table, nobody would pick them as even cousins of each other. So it just shows how important that yeast is to the outcome of a beer.
So you did split the wort into two fermenters?
100%. It was one brew.
So it's one brew day. Everything is exactly identical. You just split it into two fermenters, pitched to different yeast.
We've got questions in the audience, but we need the microphone. No questions about a microphone. We're very strict. Just because we want people online to hear the questions.
Oh.
You can ask my question.
Yeah, so you say they were exactly the same, but was the fermentation conditions the same in terms of time and temperature?
Temperature wasn't the same because lager yeast likes a cooler fermentation and Belgian yeast likes a warmer temperature. So if you fermented them at the same temperature, it would be a skewed experiment because one of them would have preferred it and the other one would just taste bad.
Yeah, you're introducing more bias than
Yeah.
changing it.
But they both had the same amount of. They were brewed on the same day. They were packaged within the same week, so they both had the same amount of time in tank. Which, I mean, you'd often think lagers would spend more time in tank, but stronger Belgian beers also benefit for a little bit more time of resting and kind of reincorporation of those strong flavors, developing of flavors, as Henry just said.
So you were saying that you fermented these beers in an open tank. So the yeast were happy, not under pressure. They're able to bubble along. But don't lager yeasts live at the bottom of the beer? And so wouldn't there be that pressure from just the liquid of the beer on top?
So my tanks are wider than they are tall. So there's only about a metre and a half of pressure down on them. Yeah. So lager does ferment on the bottom, but ale yeast, when it stops fermenting, it drops to the bottom as well. So I've got conical cone fermenters because they're amazing and they make good beer as well. But when it falls to the bottom, you look at the yeast and the yeast cells that have done all of this hard work fermenting all the beer, they fall to the bottom of that cone and then they've got all of the pressure of all the beer down on the bottom of it and it's all pointing downwards and it's squishing those little yeast cells. And they're not happy with that. So, yeah.
Sorry, Kelsey. I was just going to say, you said that lager yeast prefers colder temperatures. Yep. Why do you think that species developed that appreciation of that temperature?
Pretty deep.
Oh, I thought you were going to answer that, Ali.
They grew up in Tasmania.
My guess would be regionality. Where the yeast was originally from would be my guess, but...
Where was it from? Does anyone know?
Oh, Germany.
I read something that they found it on a leaf in a forest somewhere.
South America.
There's actually there's a.
The caves of Bavaria, the lager strain. There you go.
Which I assume is cold.
I think there's also a room about Argentinian barrels or something as well.
Yeah, it's South America. There's actually proof that it was somehow before Bavaria that it was in South America.
Yeah, they used
Hybridized in Bavaria. There's actually been found that was the original story, but it has been found in Burgundy that the same hybridization has actually occurred in other places throughout. The world. So it's not actually specifically, they did actually think it was originally from wood coming in from South America into Germany and then into the caves and then interacting with yeast in the caves. But they've actually found the same yeast cells from South America
throughout Europe as well, so they don't actually know specifically where it came from. But the one thing is that lager yeast is not actually found in the wild anywhere. It only actually started in these caves. So.
But just to plug, we have a blog. We have a few blogs on sciencemadebeerable.com or bearablescience.com. Should get that right. We do have. It sounds like an outdated story about where lager yeast come from, but at least it's the start of the story, so you can go and read about that too.
I think there was a question in the middle that we went on a tangent, so we missed this. So we should probably jump to that question. Sorry.
Hello. Thank you. I really enjoyed this last experiment, and I was curious. You talk about having thousands of yeast strains to choose from, and I'm curious if anyone is still experimenting about finding or mutating new yeast strains to, for the future of beer and having new yeast to play with.
Yeah, it's absolutely happening. There's GMO happening, which Henry mentioned, but there's also people just breeding yeasts together. So there's some really cool. As craft beer evolves, the suppliers to our craft brewers evolve. So for a long time, mass-produced beer was the only beer and the majority beer, and so the people making ingredients for beer were really just targeting them. And so they're making basic ingredients that would make more profitable, more easy drinking beer. Now that craft beer has boomed around the world, there's these suppliers who are able to kind of invest money into yeast labs, into hop labs, into all of these really cool investigations to provide fantastic ingredients for all of us to use. So yeah, I've been following a Canadian yeast lab called ExBEERimental, and they do some really cool yeast breeding, and so they grab like Kvik yeasts from Scandinavia and blend it in with this yeast from here to try and make something that's a little bit more tame to use in the main brewing industry. And so yeah, they're doing some kind of yeast husbandry, I will call it, to make kind of non-GMO targeted yeasts that'll do things.
Yeah.
What, have you got something, Ali?
Oh, no, just 100%. Like, just as much as you hear about new hop varietals coming out, which is probably a more exciting topic that maybe gets put to the public a little bit more, like we've got this brand new experimental hop in it. There is just the same amount of research going on, and a lot in New Zealand, actually, which is really cool. Because while some countries are going down the GMO route, some countries cannot for legal reasons. So there are entire labs trying to figure out how they can do the same thing without that, or a similar process that's not considered genetically modifying, but is splicing and reintroducing, and like you said, like this husbandry kind of thing. There are, just as many labs looking at that kind of stuff as there are on the hop side of things. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah, I know Bluestone Yeast are doing really cool things in Australia, which is great to have someone here in Australia doing it. I think it's really exciting when you think about yeast, you think about how quick the generation time is. Like, you compare that to, species that we're familiar with, birds, etc.
You mentioned birds.
I did it, didn't I? But, it takes tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years for these new species to be created, whereas, when generation time is really small, you can have these drastic changes through mutations, etc., quite quickly.
Yeah, and I guess that goes back to, where does lager yeast come from? Where does any yeast come from? It comes from the air and landing in a beer and somebody going, oh, that beer tastes really good, I'm going to make another one out of that. And then you go, oh, that was shit, I'm not going to do that again. And you go, this one over here tastes good, I'm going to make another one, that's better, that's better, that's better. And then you maintain making that yeast, making that beer. And so that is how we get the modern yeast strains that we've got, is by people just selecting them over time by choosing the best tasting beer.
And even with the wild strains, sorry.
Keep going.
There's brewers in Australia who are going out hiking and just swabbing plants to get yeast strains. It's like, I think it's always going to continue to be an amazing area of the brewing scene.
And it does have so much impact on flavor, just as much as, I think, can everyone taste the difference between these two beers? Like, can you actually taste and smell the difference? Yeah,
Yeah, it's
it's
very
a
noticeable.
massive difference. And that is yeast. That's not coming from hops. That is coming from yeast.
We got a question in the audience.
Yes, you have a question in the audience. A couple of things. One, hello from Team Yeast. I was wondering, you were talking about the perceived sweetness between the different beers, and you were talking about attributing that to phenols and whatnot, but I was wondering if there was a difference in ABV between the beers, given as they have different yeasts and yada yada.
There is, yeah.
Ooh.
So-
And wait.
Okay. You can keep
Oh,
going.
sorry,
Okay.
yeah.
Do you want to know
And
first
one
before
of-
your next question, or?
No. This is
Okay.
the same
Yeah,
part.
go.
One of my friends, either to my left or my right, reckoned he perceived a 0.4% difference between them. Just to put that out before you give your numbers, so that it's
So everything's on the table.
yeah, right. Go.
The Belgian is 6.6 and the Bock is 6.4.
Point 2. We did also publish this on the Beerable website and Facebook page like a month ago.
That's
so.
all right. That's all right. People don't really care. No, you can write anything on a can. People don't care. So the Belgian one I actually find sweeter because you've got those sweeter esters, but technically it's got less sugar in it. It is a drier beer, but to me it tastes much, much sweeter. So that it's another cool experiment. You can have a less sweet beer that tastes sweeter from the impacts of the flavour compounds made by the yeast. So the yeast made these flavours that taste sweet, but it's not sugar.
Another question. There's another question.
Dare I mention winemaking? That everyone always says ages like a fine wine. Do you think older strains of yeast age, or do they, like if you had a 200-year-old strain of yeast, would it produce the same beer over and over again with the same ingredients compared to some of this newer yeast coming out?
So it depends on how you're framing that question, because if you freeze that 200-year-old strain of yeast and use the same strain over and over again, so you go back to the original little vial and you prop it up again and you make a beer, and you go back to the vial and prop it up and make a beer, then you're keeping the same.
Same mother culture.
It will, if you try and take it out of a tank and move it into another tank and then move it into another tank and move it into another tank, there will be so much shift in about, if it was a Belgian beer, in probably 5 generations, 5 different tanks. Past the first one, it would be completely different beer. So if you keep going back to the first one, look, I don't know the answer to your question.
Let's throw a twist in this, right? So sorry, you go.
I think there'd be some difference.
There'd be differences, but I don't think that age differently.
Yeah, okay.
So long answer short, I don't think that age differently. It would depend on the strain because there's so many different strains. But yeah, it depends on how you're using that yeast.
So I can't remember how long ago it was, but there was a shipwreck they found all the bottles and they recultivated the yeast from that and rebrewed the beer.
Yep.
So do you think that would have tasted differently to it did back then, or is that too broad of a question?
I guess because the beer's 200 years old, it'd be quite hard to taste it. But
nobody will ever know. But I
Materials, different materials.
yeah, it's different.
Raw
I mean,
material.
beer is also an agricultural product, like Lindsay just said. Different materials. So we've got hops growing in different fields, harvested at different times. We've got malt growing in different fields, malted at different times. So the raw materials are changing. We're making an agricultural product using a microbial kind of organism. It's a tricky thing to do, to make the same thing over and over. When you think of it like that, you're harvesting something from the field and relying that to be the same. And then you're relying on this little organism that we've been talking about that makes foam different in the same beer to make the same beer over and over again. So it's a really tough one to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. But appreciate it.
Yeah.
And you
it's
spoke
fun.
about wine. And
Sorry.
No, it's perfect.
You're
And
out of here.
You would have heard about terroir.
Sorry.
terroir, and it's like where grapes grow on the
yes,
hill,
yeah.
and like their sunlight hours and the amount of water they get and the type of soil they're grown in. Exact same thing for hops, and they're now proving it.
So there's just too many factors, isn't
There's
there?
too many factors. It's not just grapes. We've got 4 things that are doing wild stuff together. It's a big party.
Thank you.
As far as aging beer, though, like some beers age better than others. So if you're wanting to cellar a beer, like which Molly Rose does incredible. Don't look at me like that. Molly Rose does incredible beers that cellar really well, right? Like lots of yeast strains that mature and age over time, saisons, saison yeast strains that slowly digest sugars, so their flavors do change and evolve, much like wine. Nick, do you want to kind of talk on that? Like,
I can. I want to go back to the original question too. The yeast cell that you capture and it's live, if you cultivate that up and grow it well, it will produce something that's like in the ballpark of what was there. So for example, I've bought yeast from the lab we were talking about from Canada that was taken from, it's Brettanomyces. It was taken from Berliner Weiss that used Brettanomyces up until 1980 or 1975 or something like that. And so all Berliner Weiss had Brettanomyces in it, and then they stopped using it because it's a pain in the ass. But it disappeared, and this Brettanomyces that you use in Berliner Weiss, it was called the Champagne of the North, and it would make citrusy, beautiful tropical flavours. Amazing. But they stopped using it. And they actually found some really old bottles, and they took the Brett out of that, and they've cultivated it up, and I've used it in Berliner Weisses since. And it does do what it says on the label. And from historical accounts, it tastes like those old Berliner Weisses did. So yes, you can grab old yeast and try and make a new beer, but it's not a static thing. Yeast is a living organism.
Just to clarify, what is Brett?
It is a non-Saccharomyces fermenting microorganism. It's a wild yeast that makes funky flavors in sour and wild beers.
It's like Saccharomyces' naughty cousin or something like that.
Yeah, kind of.
Naughty sounds bad though. That sounds weird.
It's not a 5-minute conversation.
it does eat sugars a lot slower, and it eats more complex sugars that other yeast strains leave behind. You
don't want it in your brewery if you don't want it in your brewery.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, while it's wonderful and exciting, you may not want it around your other strains of yeast.
You'll never get it out of the brewery.
Or it might bully all those other yeasts out of the place.
Audience.
There's another question in the back.
Yeah, some great conversations about yeast. As a home brewer...
You sound enthusiastic.
Well, yeah. I've been home brewing for a long time, so I like to keep things simple. And yeast is something I'm not played around with much because I don't have a lot of room to play around with different yeasts. Is this something you think home brewers should play around with more? Because from what you're saying, I've always been told for probably 2 decades from a lot of old age home brewers that yeast is very important. Is it something we should be playing around with more?
That's a hard one because it depends what you want out of the beer. Because it's also the easiest thing to mess up. Because it is a living organism, so if you make it sad, your beer is going to be sad. And there's nobody likes a sad beer. It's terrible. So if you've got a robust yeast strain and it's making the beers that you like, then stick with it. It works in your environment and it works with your conditions and your brew kit, then stick with it. If you'd like to make if you'd like to make a diverse beer from what you're currently making, then yeast is a great spot to start. Does that answer?
Yeah.
And there are more robust yeast strains then there are some less robust yeast strains. So make sure you choose the ones you can play around with them and choose the more robust ones.
Like houseplants.
Like houseplants, yeah. Don't get a fiddle leaf fig of yeasts. Because they'll just fucking drop their leaves.
Just die.
We spend $80 and they'll die.
We've got a question online about your dish fermenters. Have you actually tested whether they make a difference? Have you brewed split batch and brewed a beer in a conical versus a dish?
Yeah, 100%. I've even used our core range Saison, which is called When Life Gives You Lemons. It's a lemon farmhouse ale. I can't make that in any other shape fermenter. It tastes different. I've even brewed a USO5, so the most basic common ale yeast.
The workhorse.
The workhorse. The grunt of craft breweries. I've brewed that in the dish bottoms versus the conicals, and it comes out, I think, better. Yeah.
Better how?
Cleaner, brighter, just better flavour. Just better.
Yeah.
Just more delish, more yum.
Love it.
Yeah, I have tested it, and so we don't anything IPA. We use our conicals like these ones, IPA, hoppy, pale ale, anything like that. But if we're going to do an English ale where we lean heavily on the yeast, so like a bitter or a porter or a mild or something like that, these cool styles that you guys are all buying heaps of, right? Or we do a Saison or a Belgian blonde or something like that, also cool styles. We can only do them in the dish bottom because they just taste completely different. It's also much like they're much harder to fuck up if you put them in the dish bottom. Like they work better. Yeah.
And do you think that's a lot to do with the stress on the yeast? Interesting.
And also like the evolution of bad flavors. So when you ferment, there's lots of bubbles coming out, and so it doesn't get trapped. So let's say you've got a 3,000 litre tank that goes up, a 3,000 litre tank that goes wide. If there's bubbles coming up through, it's not going to dissolve as easily in the beer because it comes out quicker.
So if you've got other byproducts that you might not want trapped in that liquid, they are coming up.
Yeah, like
through
sulfur, for example.
Yeah,
sulfur.
100%.
Sulfur is a big one that happens at the end of ferment. It's part of the life cycle of yeast. It spits it out. And if there's not much beer between where the yeast is making the sulfur and where it can escape out, it's not going to dissolve as easily into the beer.
Sulfur, for those, just for a sensory aspect, if you ever smell like eggs in your beer, like it has like a real eggy kind of smell sometimes, that's sulfur for something that's like...
Yum.
It's not great
Or
unless you like
struck
love
match.
it. Yeah, struck match as well.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Well, we do. While Ollie walks over, I'm going to ask a question from here to save time. Explain like I'm 5. Difference between vitability versus viability.
Vitality? Is it vitality?
Vitability. It says vitability. And
Vitability.
but it probably is vitality.
That's an autocorrect. Vitality versus viability.
It's like the auto prompt kind of thing. Like,
I think in layman's terms for me, viability is how many dead cells you've got in a culture. So say you're 80% viable, 20% of those are dead. Vitality is how active that yeast ferments. So how quick it gets to where you want it to get to, how quick it drops out of suspension, how quick it basically ferments. It's kind of harder to measure. I don't know enough about science to know how to measure that either.
Yeah, but also look at that business degree coming
Oh,
through.
yeah, the business degree. Yeah, that's my understanding of it anyway.
perfect. Thank you for that. Audience.
I'll start with the statement again. Both beers are bangers. Obviously, like with a conical fermenter, it's super easy with like harvesting and reusing yeast. With your dish fermenters, do you do that at all, and how do you go about it?
It's a pain in the ass. So I've started. We've only got 5 fermenters, so we're really small. So generally we don't reuse yeast that much because we just don't have another Belgian ale coming on shortly afterwards to brew it. But I've started attempting to use the dish bottom fermenters like they use them in England, where they have the Yorkshire squares. Google that one later. They're quite pretty fermenters. Or in Germany, where they do open fermentation of lagers, where they just spend like the first 5 days in there. And so most of the esters and phenols, we described that before, happen in the first 24 to 36 hours of fermentation. So, and a lot of the fermentation happens in the first 3 to 6 days, depending on the beer that you're doing. So after that fermentation is mainly done, you can transfer it out into another tank. So I've started playing around with transferring it out of the dish bottoms into the conicals, and then catching the yeast out of the bottom of that when I want to.
Do we have more questions in the audience? One more? We'll go one more and then we'll... 9:30.
It's a school night as well.
Very important question for Lindsay. Which one was the biscuit meant to go with?
Oh yeah, no, that was a question for the audience. Can I just ask for the biscuit, for the crown, who preferred it with the lager yeast strain, the one without the rubber band? And who preferred it with the Belgian? Yeah. It was supposed to go with the Belgian. It turns into like Dr. Pepper. It's a really good time. I don't know. So wild. No, yeah, it's like that was the easiest pairing for me. Like I knew as soon, like I read the description. I know Nick's beers quite well. I'm lucky enough to live in Melbourne. I know he's great with Belgian yeast. I had a feeling it was going to go amazing with that caramel crown. The flavors transform completely into like, for me, like Dr. Pepper is what it turns into, which like no insult, but like it's great. It's a good time. Yeah, so definitely with the Belgian. I think it's interesting. That one's the most interesting because it just doesn't hit the same spot with the lager yeast, with the lager beer. So yeah.
Which one goes with the kettle chip?
None of them.
Trick question.
Did anyone just love the kettle chips with everything? You're wrong. Just kidding. Taste is subjective. Mine's just better. I'm kidding. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Question for everyone. Brewing science. How important do you think that is for making better beer, or even just good beer? Do you think it's important, or do you think you can make good beer without a knowledge of science? And you don't have to answer it. I know we're beer. Well, I know we're Science Made Beerable, but you don't have to.
I'll answer. You can make good beer without science, but you can't make great beer.
100% agree. Like I said right at the beginning, like brewing is just one big experiment. So if you're not trying to better that and that doesn't facilitate further questions on how to better that and test certain things, then I think you're doing it wrong.
Anything else?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess brewing's a number of things. It's a lot of mechanical stuff, physically doing things. But I guess if you're physically there doing something, moving this valve, doing that, adding this ingredient, but you don't know why you're doing it, then I guess if you get that knowledge to why you do this, why you pull that lever, why you add this ingredient, it can further your understanding of it and obviously make better beer in the process. So
you might pull a different lever.
Exactly. Yes.
And I think it proves, science and beer, it does prove that things are delicious. Like science is delicious. It doesn't just apply to these abstract thoughts and high-end things. Like you taste it every day, and when you want to understand why does that work with that, like that is science. You have to, in order to repeat the same thing you just did, you have to understand the science. So you could do something once and it'll be great, but unless you understand what you did.
I think that's a great place to leave this event. I think we've wrapped it up really nicely. That, yeah, brewing is science and it's super important. So thank you everyone who's joined us in person, online, at the watch parties. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. We still have a few unanswered questions on the online chat, and also I'm sure a few of you have questions for the brewers. We'll put the online questions to the brewers and hopefully get some answers for you, and anyone else feel free to come up and talk to us at the end. But thank you so much for our amazing panel for joining us. Obviously... you've all been really good sports and you know, taken this whole experimental idea on board and really run with it, and the results have been awesome. So we're really, really happy with the way it's all gone, so thanks so much. We've actually been quite busy here today at Shambles. Well, the Shambles crew have been more so.
Well, mostly Jamie.
Jamie did most of the work, to be honest.
We had lunch.
We did. We talked a lot and had lunch, but we've been doing a collaborative brew. So we've created a beer inspired by science, and that will be released in the next couple of months. So keep an eye on our socials for that.
It's keg only. Just want to throw that.
Keg
out there.
only.
Keg
So
only.
yeah, it'll be
You have to go to the pub.
in Tasmania.
No one's sad about that.
Yeah, exactly.
But thanks everyone who supported Science Made Beerable through this experimental science event and through National Science Week. Make sure you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and you can keep up to date with all our nerdy blogs and things that we'll be trying to post more of on our website. We'd also love your feedback. So send us your feedback on the event however you can, through socials, email, however you like. This event has also been recorded, so if you want to watch it back, or if you know someone who loves beer science who couldn't join, you can also watch the recording again. And the beers are still available to purchase through Black Arts and Sparrows online. So thank you so much for everyone for joining, and good night.
Thank you.
See you.